Welcome to our study on the book of Romans. This is Sonship Establishment, and this is session 27. Now, we've been looking at that fifth question of the questions here in Romans chapter 8, and now we're going to take a look at the second part of the question. And remember, that first part is, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? And now we've gotten down to that part where he begins to detail not some who's, but some what's. And so let's take a look at this first verse in Romans chapter 8, verse 35. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Question mark, and then small case s, indicating that this is a continuation of that question. I know this is something that's not used very often in English, but it is actually utilized. Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? Now here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take us through these seven very briefly. But the only reason that I want to do it at all is because I don't want you to just read the verse and just think of it as information. I want these terms to actually trigger something specific in your thinking. Now, these are categories of suffering. So, in fact, I'm going to, at one point, we're going to kind of step aside and we're going to see this category expand. Paul's going to talk about that, and we'll do that. But I really need, when you're reading this, to see that these are, as you continue through sonship, they are real possibilities for you to encounter. But I want to make a point. I guess I'll just bring the point up now, and then we'll discuss the detail of it later. Every single one of the things in this list, they are not confined to the policy of evil alone. All of these things could be experienced as part of the suffering of this present time. There's certainly been people in the past, not because of sonship. You understand when I say the suffering of this present time. But there have been people who have suffered hunger and nakedness or persecution and distress, and that had nothing to do with sonship. In fact, it didn't have anything to do with their spiritual life at all. It was just maybe the part of the world in which they lived, or the economy that they lived in. In this country, there have been people who have been not so well off before and had very hard life. In fact, you know, I saw something the other day that kind of reminded me of the Depression years in this country, and it was tough. And if you look at different, well, I don't want to get into a deal on that, but what I'm saying is those are things that you could experience, but you would be experiencing them for a different reason. Now, you say, so what's really the difference in seeing this as part of the suffering of this present time or seeing it as part of the policy of evil? What's the difference? The big difference is what is at stake. No matter what you do with your sonship, if it's part of the suffering of this present time, that doesn't really change the circumstance. But when it's the policy of evil, you will know. It's not you'll be left guessing about it. You will know that because you are an educated son, this particular affliction has come upon you, and the only way to make that stop is to quit your sonship. Now, that doesn't mean that Satan will do it forever. That's not necessarily the case. These things will come and go. And sometimes they'll be more persistent than at other times. But they're all meant to make you walk away from your sonship life. That's the leverage that's being used to make you make that decision to stop. And so it's hoping to bring enough inconvenience and pain and problem into your life that you finally just throw in the towel to get some relief. And that's what those things are about. Now, I'm going to go through, as we get ready to go through this list, I'm going to make a statement that contradicts itself. So I'm just admitting it right off the bat. I don't want these things to just scare you to death. But I do want you to have a healthy fear when you look at these things, because that means you're really seeing them for what they could be. Does that make sense? It's almost like saying, I don't want you to be afraid, but I want you to be afraid. It's not exactly right. But I need you to see these as more than just a list. because that's how we read too many times. We just kind of read things in the list. And so as we get ready to go through these, we're just going to say enough about it that I hope that I can bring to your mind the kinds of things that we're actually discussing here. Okay, now you can probably see by just looking at the list, I think we probably mentioned this before, that these things are moving from the milder to the more severe, which means that these things are actually going to escalate as your sonship education escalates. So do the attacks against you. Now, let me just say it like this. It is not until, remember those 4 skills that we talked about? Remember we talked about wisdom and justice and judgment and equity? And it is not until you get to this one of judgment. Now, and that's going to be over in the education in Romans 13. When you get to this place, you are going to put on the armor of light. That really, well, we'll certainly talk about it when we get over there. But you're going to put on the armor of light, and that becomes the green light for the very first personalized attack of the policy of evil to now be made against you. You're going to see that when we talk about the first word here, tribulation, in just a moment. But as you go through and finish this up, then you become a simple son, and there are certain things that can be done to a simple son that Satan is allowed to do. But he cannot go beyond that. He's going to have to play by the rules, so to speak. And so as you move from being a simple son to being a young man, the kinds of attacks that can be made against you are going to be able to escalate. And you'll see more of these come into play. Now, I really believe this is right. I really believe that this is accurate. But even as I say this, there's some areas that you're going to be looking at and saying, well, how does that work? And I hope we'll be able to talk about those. And I just dawned on me, I'm creating a problem when you haven't had one yet. So I don't want to do that. So let me just say that when you get over to the end of these, it would be the way that I understand it is, those would be reserved as attacks by the policy of evil for a fully educated son. Not for someone, I don't want you to get the idea that, boy, we're just going to get into the curriculum and suddenly, you know, my life is going to be on the line over sonship. That's not going to be the issue there, okay? So in trying to make that clear, and before we get into that first one, let me just say that this that we're discussing now is geared to make you absolutely sure of 2 issues. We've mentioned these before, and I've given them to you in your notes, and I'm going to give them to you now again, that everything that you needed to have take place or that you will need in the future is going to be provided for you and to you without any exception. You're never going to be found lacking. And that confidence that that is going to happen is important, that it gets done in this part of your sonship establishment. You're not going to get to a place where you're going to say, I need something and it's not available to me. That's not going to happen. And the second thing is, nothing will be able to separate you from the provision that your Heavenly Father has made. Once He has done that, there's nothing that can block that or thwart that or bring it to naught. You can quit and you can walk away and you can ignore it, but that is still there, which means at any point, a son or daughter could come back and pick that up and get that right and move on. So with that being said, let's take a look now at the first of these attacks in these categories, and the one that we've got highlighted in this verse is tribulation. Now, when you talk about tribulation, almost everything in the list could be called a tribulation of some kind. So as a very broad umbrella, you could call the whole thing that. But the kind of tribulation that's talking about here, and let me just see if I can put something up here that'll kind of get us going in that. There is a progression to this, and this kind of tribulation is a mental tribulation. It is an attack that's geared to shake your confidence. It's an attack that is geared to make you doubt. It's an attack that's geared to cause you to question, and it doesn't matter what that is. Doesn't matter if you're questioning the Father's ability to do what He does, or the curriculum's ability to do what He said it would do, or your ability as a son to be able to utilize that. That's what the first attack is about. In fact, these first ones all have to do with some kind of mental tribulation that's going to come your way. And if you think about it, that actually makes sense. Because if you're Satan and you've just come out of your sonship establishment and now you're getting the education, what you want to do is you want to come now and you want to get someone to start doubting about this and to start thinking, you know, is this really going to work? Is this really going to happen for me? This sounds really great, but is this really going to come out the way I think it is? That's the kind of tribulation that you're going to face first of all, and that's why this establishment is critical to getting done before you ever start the education and you get that first attack when you get to that third decision-making skill, because once you have that issue settled once and for all, you don't have to worry about coming back and looking at that anymore. Now, the second word in the list, give me that next one, is distress. Now, I'm going to give you a definition. In fact, I'm going to give you a couple of them. I'm going to go to Charles Smith, book on synonyms. Give me that next one. There you go. Now, I know this is long, but just follow through this. Distress may be from either physical or mental cause, but in itself is more mental than physical, as distress does not imply bodily suffering. Distress may be independent of physical pain. And isn't that true? Someone can be in distress, yet it doesn't mean they've been injured or hurt physically in any way. It is a painful interference with the mind's calmness and activity, a combined feeling of suffering and helplessness. He who is in distress is distracted in mind and uneasy, not knowing whether to turn or how to procure relief. So the second one, this distress, there's another mental attack. That this is something now that's causing your mind, and as a matter of fact, this is a step up from the tribulation, the mental trouble that you're having with something. Now distress, see what this, it said, and we're going to kind of refer back to this in a minute, but it says, no, back me up one, please, Trent. It says, not knowing whether to turn or how to procure relief. We're going to look at an example in the Scripture of this very kind of thing in just a moment. And when there is some confusion about what ought to be done. And so that's a step up in the mental attack of distress. Now give me the George Crabbe. There you go. Distress is the pain felt when in a strait from which we see no means of extricating ourselves. Distress always depends upon some outward cause. Anxiety often lies in the imagination. Distress is produced by the present. Anxiety respects the future. Distress arises from one circumstance or another. What George Crabbe is doing is talking about that shade of meaning difference between distress and anxiety. Because as you look at this, you might be thinking, oh, well, that's anxiety. But he's right. Anxiety is really about things that are in the future. Distress is about something in the present. And that's the word in the list. And so you're talking about something that's happening right there that's causing you now to be confused about what you're supposed to do. And believe me, Satan is very good at that. And so even though you're being told about it now and you're being warned about it in advance, you need to know that Satan is very good at camouflaging all of that. And we're going to pick that theme up in just a moment and talk about it again in just a moment. So in these first two categories, we have a mental attack that's going on, and it's beginning to progress from a general questioning and uncertainty to now a distress because of a particular situation. Now that takes us to the third word in the list, and that is persecution. And persecution can be both mental and physical. Please. Thanks, Ron. Wayne will have to edit this out. I don't know. Leave it in. If it was Dr. Pepper, we could leave it in and maybe get a promo from Dr. Okay. Okay. I don't know. No, I don't. I need a new larynx. I don't know. I don't know what the problem is. Thank you, Ron. So persecution. Persecution can be mental and physical. You can see how persecution can be of a mental nature. I mean, you can see that. That would be someone saying things, and by that persecuting you. But it can also mean physical things. It can also be mild, or it can be severe. A mild would be, we're just kind of shunning you. But a more severe means of that might be the loss of, remember this is all about sonship anyway, might be the loss of your job or the loss of your home or something like that, something more severe. And again, I want you to remember that all of these, although they could be the result of the suffering of this present time, these are also to be understood that they're in the arsenal of the policy of evil. And even when the economy is great and everybody is doing well, then, oh, okay. You know, I've talked all day today. And, okay. Was that a nice way of saying I never shut up? Yeah. Linda's so tactful. No, I know that. That's pretty good. Is that from you? Oh, thank you, honey. Okay. Never mind. My mind is running off in all kinds of ways. Never mind. The physical can be a mild form of persecution, can be a more severe time. And even when the economy is going well and everyone is prospering, the policy of evil can bring in a time, if you lose your job, and actually bring you to a place of poverty in the midst of that. Now, listen, I don't know if I'm far enough along to be able to definitively talk about this. So let me just tell you as the best I can right here. That would be pretty tough to do in this country in a time like this. But there are areas of the world in which that would be much easier to do. Or you follow what I'm saying with that. And in other words, it would be a lot easier to get relief from that here in this country than if you live somewhere where everybody was just poor as a church mouse and really didn't have anything. Now, I'm not saying the policy of evil won't attempt to do that or couldn't bring that to pass to some degree, because remember, these are categories. These are not, we're not nailing this down to a specific thing. These are just categories. And these are all a result of your sonship. If you inadvertently cut someone off in the interstate and they try to run you off the road, that is not part of the policy of evil. You can't come in and say, boy, the devil tried to run me off the road today. No, it was just a short-fused guy on the interstate who has road rage issues. That's what, by the way, he doesn't care about your sonship one way or the other. So that's not what that is. So let's just go to the next one, because I think everybody understands persecution. Famine is the next one. And when you talk about famine, then you should think of it in terms of hunger. Now, that may range from not getting proper nutrition, and that can be the case. I can remember when I worked at a church in Virginia. I was a young guy. I lived in a little 2-bedroom house, and I think my daughter was born. I can't remember if my son was born or was on the way, but anyway, friend of mine had lost his job, and they had a small child, so they moved in with us in that little 2-bedroom house, and so we didn't, and then right after that, there was 2 of us guys working on church staff, and the pastor called us in, and he said, "Fellows, I just want to tell you that we've experienced some problems in the church, and because of that, the offerings have gone down. And because the offerings have gone down, we're all going to have to go off salary." And he said, "Now, if you want to go, I'll write you a letter of recommendation. But if you want to stay, then what I'm asking you to do is not tell anybody that you're off salary." And he said, just do, whatever you want to do, I'll be behind you and I'll understand. Well, my understanding of the scriptures back then was very well-meaning but very shallow. And so, I did what everybody would normally do, right? "Dear God, what do you want me to do?" I don't even want to talk about that anymore, but we stayed for a while. And I remember living for weeks at a time on what we called hoe cakes and gravy. And a hoe cake is nothing more than a type of homemade biscuit. Now, I love biscuits and gravy, but about the 9th day, not so much. And I remember we joked about it and said, "Are we going to have hoe cakes and gravy or gravy and hoe cakes?" And they go, "Gravy and hoe cakes." "Oh, good, because last night we had hoe cakes and gravy. Tonight it'll be different." We joked about that. Now, you just do what you do, right? And I know there were folks in a lot worse situation than I've ever been. I know that. But you know what? If you live on that very long, there's a nutrition aspect to that doesn't really work well. And I remember one of the deacons came over. I know he had to know, but he came over and he knocked on the door and he said, "Hey, can you help me unload some groceries out of the back of my car?" And he had a bunch of groceries in sacks in the back of his car, and we were carrying that in. And I remember going through the living room going, "Meat," we were carrying it through. I thought, "Oh boy," And but my point is, and by the way, don't confuse that. That was not the policy of evil. I was not being attacked over my sonship because I didn't understand sonship back then. That was just part of the circumstances that had unfolded in life. Now, but the policy of evil can bring something like that about, and when you're talking about famine, you're talking about going through periods of time when you're talking about hunger, and that's a very physical thing. And so now you've escalated from mental things to physical and mental to now physical. And when you get to this one is different. Does anybody recognize why? Why is this one different? What'd Trent say? Oh, okay. Well, okay. He's usually right. I don't know what he said. Well, but look, this is a necessity of life. Just because everybody doesn't like you, or you're persecuted by your enemies, can you live with that? You don't want to, but you can. The mental distress, those things, has anyone ever been in distress before in their life? I'll tell you when distress comes along, and I didn't want to bring it up, but, if you've got something going on with you physically and you haven't yet figured out what it is, do you know how that can impact you mentally? And boy, that can really work on you. Now, I've been there. Probably not in the condition that lots of folks have been, but I've been there where, man, I mean, it just really got on me. Well, those things, I mean, as bad as they are, when you start dealing now with the necessities of life, now this gets serious. This may actually be a place where you could draw a line and say, you know, okay, sonship can take me to here, but can sonship take me to here? Now, let me interject this right now. Right now, you may be looking at that and saying, I don't know if I could do that right now. And you know what? You may be right, because you haven't gone through the education that's meant to get you to the place where you can deal with that yet, right? So don't look at any of this right now and say, oh my God, I think that's part of the Corinthians problem. They looked at the things happening to Paul, and before they ever got any of that that could enable them to endure that, they bailed out on that. Now, you're talking about a very critical area of life in famine. And now let's do the next one. The next one is nakedness. And that doesn't necessarily, because it's a category, it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have any clothes, but it could mean that you just don't have proper clothing. I mean, if you live in an area that gets cold and you don't have the means to be able to keep warm, that's going to be a problem. By the way, we consider food and clothing to be necessities of life, don't we? So all this is doing is really, once again, it's adding on top of these other things that are happening. When we talked about persecution being the loss of your job, well, let me tell you what, if you lose your income, there's a good chance for some of us, if we lost our income, you might not be eating the way you eat now. You might not have the kind of clothing, you know, that you enjoy now. And those things could certainly, and if you look at that, by the way, famine and nakedness, if someone didn't have food and they didn't have clothes, you would say they were in what kind of condition? Yeah, you would say that they were in poverty. I'm sorry. You know, I'm talking about this stuff, and my mind is just doing all kinds of crazy stuff. And it distracts me a lot. I'm thinking, you know what? They don't have food, and they don't have clothing, but they do have a tattoo. So I was just, I'm just, because you know it's true, don't you? You know it's true. Oh, I'm just tempted to tell you a story, but I'm not. Okay, no, I'm not. No. But, but it's true. Okay, and you know what? If you have a tattoo, I don't care. I'm just saying. If you don't have it, oh, never mind. Look.
Well, the deal against tattoos was under the Israel program.
I'm just saying, the people that can least afford it are, so often. Okay, since I'm on this, let me just finish it off by saying it like this. I don't care what you do, honestly. There was a day, Tommy will tell you because he knew me in those days, there was a day when I was against everything. It didn't matter what it was, I was against it. Are you against? Yes, what? That's the way that would work. I was against everything. I'd been, right, as an independent Baptist, I was mentored that you preach against everything, and that's what you did. And then you learn about grace, and man, that's and if you say to me, was that hard? Well, you're teaching an old dog new tricks. Yeah, that was hard. But you know what? I really do understand grace. So when I say this, I don't care what you do. I don't. I really don't. In fact, things that I used to look at and think they were a sin, I now understand as a sonship decision. Now, I'm not trying to give you a license to go out and do stupid stuff and say, you know what? I heard Mike in a study say it was all okay. It's not all okay. But I will say that the Scripture and my understanding of it has changed the way I have to function in life and the way I view things. That all being said as a way of disclaimer, how many people have I known that could not afford to waste a single dollar of their meager income, go out and spend a disproportional portion of it on lottery tickets? And when that first came out, there were people that spent their whole paycheck thinking they were going to hit it big and did not. I know it's a desperate attempt. I'm not trying to just throw those folks under the bus, but it kind of works in the same vein of what I'm talking about. So I guess the whole point here is, if you're hungry and naked, leave the lottery tickets and the tattoos alone. Okay, there. All right, now I've interpreted that scripture. Now, let me move you to this next one, which is poverty. Oh, you know, the whole point I was going to make is, if you've lost your job, that probably is going to be the place that you're going to find yourself. Okay. All right, peril. Now, I think I'm going to give you, yeah, I am. Charles Smith, let me see. I should have something for him. Nope, back it up. Okay, let me just read it to you. I should have put it in the PowerPoint, and I did not. Charles Smith says this: peril is always immediate and personal. A man may be in danger of losing property, but is in peril of losing his life. Danger denotes a thing, while peril denotes a condition. That which is in peril is on the way to being destroyed. That which is in danger is on the way to being lost, forfeited, or taken away. And so again, what Charles Smith is doing is showing the difference between peril and danger. Now, if you said to me, isn't a peril a danger? Well, I mean, yes, I mean, of course. But again, the kind of word that's being used here is the very word that the Apostle Paul picks up on, because I thought it was interesting that what he does is he actually starts to go through the various kinds of perils. Now, by the way, if you're in peril, what do you normally and naturally think of? What is in peril? Yeah, your life. Again, it's a very physical thing. And if you're going to talk about necessities, you're getting kind of to the ultimate necessity, aren't you? I mean, I don't have much food and I don't really have right clothing. Now my life is in peril. This is really escalating. But now give me that Corinthians passage, 2 Corinthians 11:26. And this is just out of a list of things I just wanted to show you. Paul says, in journeyings often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils by mine own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren. That's a lot of perils. And he's looking at these, he's listing these out. So when he writes peril, it really is a category, because there's a lot of different ways in which perils can come to you. And by the way, the policy of evil doesn't have to be, again, doesn't have to be, someone can rob you in the Walmart parking lot, has nothing to do with your sonship, but the policy of evil can use every single one of those as its tool to put your arm behind your back and make you cry uncle over your sonship. And that's exactly what that is geared to do. Because at this stage, when you get to here, there's only one left. I'm going to draw another line of distinction. When you get to here, wouldn't you think, if I'm right in thinking that these match your progression through sonship, that this would be reserved for a fully educated son? I mean, because any one of these, if you're in peril of losing your life, in any single one of these, you could be put to death. You could lose your life in any one of those. Now, that's going to lead us to the last one, and let me just give it to you, and that's sword. And sword is when one of the perils succeeds. It becomes more than a peril. Now it's actually accomplished what it was trying to accomplish. And we saw the Apostle Paul with all of that. By the way, did I not have 2 Corinthians 11:27 in there, Trent? Back me up. No, 27. Let me read 20. I can't believe I left that out of there. Let me read verse 27 to you. I know it's in your notes, so if you can locate it, you can look at it. When Paul continues this list of perils, here's the next verse. In weariness and painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and in thirst, in fastings often, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. He's talking about those very issues. It is really easy to forget when you're reading about the Apostle Paul, you don't think about when he's writing this, what's going on with him? Is he really in a time when he is hungry and thirsty? Is there really a time when he's experienced nakedness? I mean, when he doesn't have proper clothing? I mean, that really was something that was in his life and was noticeable, and he calls attention to it there. And I think it's instructive that he uses the very kind of terminology that he's listing over here in Romans chapter 8. So, a son who completes his education really may wind up giving his life for his sonship. Now, this is nothing more than just kind of a brief overview of these terms, because I wanted you for a moment to kind of put yourself in that position and to think about what this would be like. That it would start out with mental troubles, and it would move on into the physical realm, and then into the necessities of life, and then where your very life was in peril, and maybe even the ending of your life over sonship. Now, yes, again, that might be more difficult in this day, at this place. And because of that, some people would look back at Paul and say, he actually had an advantage because he had to go through some things that we won't necessarily go through as easily. But you understand, Paul went through everything. I mean, everything that could be there, those categories, he went through every one of them, so he's that ensample. But that doesn't mean that your education is going to be lacking. In other words, the Father will use whatever happens in your life to be able to accomplish those things that he is trying to accomplish. And as bad as these attacks sound, and they are, and I do want you to be gripped with them, I do want you to understand that there's something really to observe about that. I don't want you to be so afraid of them. If you overreact to this, it'd make you think about, well, you know what, I'm just going to drop out of my sonship now. Because that's not anything that I want to endure. And I understand that right now that's not what you want to endure. And I'm not saying you'll necessarily want to endure it. You know, God's not asking you to jump in front of a bullet, but what he is doing is he's equipping you to be able to endure whatever things may come your way. So let me flip this around if I can. He's not really giving you a list to terrify you. He is giving you a list in which you will pay the ultimate price, perhaps, for your sonship. And here's what you should know. You should be encouraged to know that the curriculum can enable you to do every single one of those to the glory of your Heavenly Father. You won't have to go into this thing trembling and quaking in your boots. You're going to go into this thing because the verse we haven't read yet is going to tell you that in all these things we are more than conquerors. And that's really where he's going to take you with this. But the first thing he has to do is say, there are some things that are going to be used to try to separate you and to get you to quit and to get you to throw in the towel. But you know, there's none of these things, though, can stand between you and the provision that your Father is going to make that equips you to endure them. And to not just grit your teeth and go through them, but to actually go through them for his glory. And then to go beyond that, to actually rejoice in tribulation. And as the sonship life increases, it's not just I have more tolerance to endure more pain, but you actually have the ability to look at those things differently, and you'll hearken back to Romans 8. you're going to go back to Romans 8 and you're going to remember all things work together for good. You're going to know that even those things are working to conform you to the image of God's Son. And that's going to be a benefit to you, not just now, but it's going to be an eternal benefit for you when you get up in the creature. And when you get up there, you'll look back on those things and you'll think, while Satan sought to do his worst, that the curriculum actually allowed me to take that and become a better son because of it. It's taking the things that were meant to destroy you and turning them into the things that benefit you. And I'm not saying you turn it into that. The curriculum enables that to be that way. Yes, you still have to go through them. Don't get to thinking that this is some kind of a magic wand that when you go through famine that you're not going to feel hungry. You will feel hungry. And you're not going to just look at it and go, oh, I just love this hungry feeling. That's not it. But you're going to realize what your endurance of that is producing in you. And look, I don't know how much this will mean to everybody, but there is a rejoicing at what is going to take place in your inner man over whatever comfort could take place in your outer man. There's really a time when you're no longer going to look at the outer things, because that's how the world really looks at it. The world looks at that as actually, that's not exactly right. Not all the world looks at it that way. What do I got left here? Where am I? There's a point that I should make here. Tommy's class is a little bit familiar with this. Remember the Stoics and the Epicureans over in Acts 17? Remember that? The Stoics and the Epicureans, that when Paul was in Athens, and remember over in Athens they only had gods everywhere, but what they really loved was what they perceived to be wisdom. It was nothing more than the wisdom of men, but they perceived it to be that. And there was two basic approaches to everything. One of them was eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Remember that old adage, you know? And that was whatever the flesh wants to do, just satisfy the flesh, you know, and that's where real happiness lies. And the other one was the philosophy of not so much the flesh, but the moral aspect and the more controlled aspect. When he talks about the Stoics and the Epicureans, he was really talking about the two ends of the spectrum. One of those was a very intellectual approach, and the other one was a very carnal approach. One of those was very fleshly, the other one was very soulish. It wanted to, it was the moral good of man. And since I've said that, where I'm really trying to go with this is, does anybody, look, oh, this is going to turn into way more than it should have. You remember what was sitting in the middle of the garden that Adam and Eve were not supposed to eat of? The tree of knowledge of good and evil. All right, let's just draw the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Here it is. Wait, the tree of what? First of all, you have to ask yourself, what would be wrong with knowing good and evil? Okay, that's right. God was going to, look, this was the tree of knowledge of good and evil. If you don't understand what's happening with that, you would be tempted to say, well, there's not anything wrong with knowing good, it's the knowledge of evil. But here's what the good was. The good and the evil were the two philosophies of men. That there was a good, let's control ourselves, and let's be morally pure, and we'll just do it ourselves. And then the evil was, we'll just run riot and do whatever we feel like. Remember the old adage back in the 60s? I grew up in the hippie generation. You know what's real? Oh, never mind. You know what? A lot of those guys are bald now. You know, that was, anyway, just saying. Oh, never mind. Am I the only? I'm not the, oh, never mind. The knowledge of good and evil was learning how to conduct yourself according to man's philosophy. This is man's good and man's evil. None of those had anything to do with this. This was not about knowing right from wrong. That's not what that was. That was about learning two counterfeit systems to godly wisdom. That's what that was. Now, I'm telling you that because I was going to make a point about this. I knew I was going to do this. I was going to give you all that background, and then I was going to say, and now... And then what was I going to say? You know what? It'll come to me. It'll come to me. And I'll hearken you back to it. All right, just remember that. Wow. That is, okay, I had a different word. I like that one better. Okay. Lack of brain function. Those things, although they can happen to you from the suffering of this present time, by the way, when they happen, they are serious. But when the policy of evil brings them about, they're serious as well. Not because the hunger, you're not more hungry under the policy of evil than you could possibly be in the suffering of this present time. Let's face it, some people in the world have starved to death. That's pretty hungry. So I'm not saying the policy of evil is somehow taking all of these and making them exponentially greater, that you're now hungrier or more naked. But my point is, what's at stake is worse. What's at stake is the very life that your Heavenly Father wants you to have. That's the danger behind the policy of evil. Now, asking that question of verse 35, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall these, and we know, and we've talked about that, the answer is no one. None of those things can separate you from what that love has accomplished. We went back and talked about that. And that's true, but do you remember that bumper sticker? It came out many, many years ago. God said it, I believe it, and that settles it. And then someone came along and revised that. And they said, God said it, and it doesn't matter if you believe it or not. That settles it. Remember that? Well, that's kind of the point that I'm making about this, is that he's telling you those things can't do that. They can't. He has made a provision for you to be able to endure every single one of them to His glory. And you're expecting to get the education that's going to enable you to do that. He's kind of showing you something that's going to be produced in you, that's going to be accomplished in you. So, in fact, give me that next verse, Trent. So when he says, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? As it is written, for thy sake we are killed all the day long. We are accounted as sheep for the slaughter. Nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors through Him that loved us. Now, in verse 36, which is the follow-up to verse 35, because in 35, you have all these things happening. And normally, if someone's going through distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril, what is going to be their outlook? How are they going to feel about that? What's the normal reaction to that? Yeah, it is despair. And so look at the verse that follows. As it is written, for thy sake we are killed all the day long. We are accounted as sheep for the slaughter. Now that verse comes out of Psalm 44. I'm going to take you back over to Psalm 44 because I want us to take a look at that. But there's another verse that I want to show you in the meantime, because what's going to be done for you as you go through these things is not just going to benefit you now. Oh, I endured that to the glory of God, and that does mean something. but it has benefit for something later. In fact, give me that next verse. You know what? I guess I got ahead of myself. I didn't mean to, but I did. Sorry. So that's what I get for not looking carefully at these notes. Verse 36, back me up one and let me connect this for everybody. As it is written. The word as is a simile. It is the word as. The words as and like are a part of speech called a simile, and they are words that show comparison so that you get an understanding of something. Those words are often read over and not observed, and it leads to a lot of doctrinal error. For example, in Acts chapter 2, and when the day of Pentecost was fully come, they were all with one accord in one place, and suddenly there came a sound, and I should have put that in yellow. There came a sound. Now he's going to describe to you what the sound was like. A sound from heaven as of a rushing mighty wind. Now, did he say there was a rushing mighty wind? No. He said there was a sound as a rushing mighty wind. Because I've heard preachers preach this and go, a great wind filled the place. No, it didn't. A sound of a great rushing wind may have filled the place, but he didn't say a wind did. That's not paying attention to the words. But we're not through with it. And it filled all the house where they were sitting. And there appeared unto them cloven tongues like as of fire. Now, that's what he's using to draw a comparison to what he saw, and it sat upon each of them. So he's trying to describe something they heard and something they saw. And to do that, he uses the word as, and here he also uses the word like to draw that comparison. It's just trying to paint the, okay, just hold on. Trying to paint the picture for you and trying to get that out. So when Paul says in Psalm 44, remember what it comes on the heels of. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall, or peril, or sword. The next thing he says, as it is written. And then he quotes Psalm 44:22. That is telling you that there is a comparison to be made between what he's writing about right here and what was being written about in Psalm 44, especially in verse 22. That's why he pulls that verse out of there and brings it into Romans chapter 8. Now, when we come back from the break, what I want to do is I want to take you over and show you some things about Psalm 44, because I think there's some things that is pretty easy to overlook in Psalm 44 if we're not careful. And I want to make sure that we observe those things and look at them for what they are.